Hello, everyone. Great to have you with us. I hope you're healthy and out of harm's way wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the 6th episode of the Voices of Sustainability virtual fireside chat series. I'm Joel Makower, chairman and co-founder of GreenBiz Group here in Oakland, California. I hope you know our events, news, and newsletters on business, sustainability, and climate tech. If not, feel free to check them out at greenbiz.com. I'm very pleased to host this edition of the Zayed Sustainability Prize's video chat series. If you're not familiar with it, the Zayed Sustainability Prize is the United Arab Emirates Pioneering Global Award for recognizing sustainability and humanitarian solutions around the world. Since its establishment more than a decade ago, the prize has been awarded to 86 winners who have collectively impacted the lives of more than 350 million people around the world through their efforts in health, food, water, energy, and global high school. So now on to today's program. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Steer, President and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund. I first met Andrew in his role as President and CEO of the World Resources Institute, a role he took on in 2012. He's also held the positions of Special Envoy for Climate Change at the World Bank and Director General of the UK Department of International Development. In fact, he has a long list of other roles and honors from around the world. Today, as I mentioned, he runs the Bezos Earth Fund, and I'm guessing that anyone watching this will already know something about that. But in case you need a reminder, this is the $10 billion philanthropic fund created by Amazon founder Jeff Bezos to address the climate crisis in its many dimensions. So with that, welcome Andrew Steer.
Thank you, Joel. Great to be here, and thanks for all you're doing at GreenBiz, and thanks also to the Zayed Sustainability Prize. It's had a wonderful impact in inspiring action over recent years. So thank you. Great to be here.
Indeed, it has. So our topic today is people, planet, and profit, the 3 dimensions of sustainability and the sustainable development goals. And I want to start with profit. Now, you once taught economics at Cambridge University, and you've written widely on the links between the economy and the natural environment. So let's talk a little bit about that. I'm still amazed that the conversation around climate can quickly get into talking about the trade-off between the financial performance and climate action, that addressing the climate crisis risks tanking the economy. And yet those in sustainability say the opposite is true, that addressing climate will create new forms of wealth and well-being. So I'd love your take, Andrew. What have we learned about money and profit as a driver of development?
Well, we have moved from a general belief in trade-off to a recognition that actually smart action on sustainability leads to more profit. This is one of the sort of really major intellectual revolutions that's taken place really just in the last 10 years. And Joel, I know you and your writing and what you've done have been very central to that. But I mean, 10 years ago, most economists, most business people, most financial managers, and even most environmentalists would say, look, it's nice to address issues of sustainability, but we're going to pay a price for it. We're going to get a lower yield. We now have a remarkable set of data that show that, in fact, over, say, a decade, it is those smart investors that put their money in high ESG investments or companies that actually do better. So this is a really remarkable shift, and it's affected the entire way we think about climate action.
So that's in the private sector. How about in the public sector, the investments that governments are needing to make around climate resilience and obviously renewable energy and in hardened infrastructure and all of that? You know, I guess, you know, the latest IPCC report, which was released just a few days before you and I are having this conversation, you know, frankly stated what a lot of people have been saying for a long time, but still it was a pretty powerful and direct account of what we're facing. But I guess given that, is having a business case for climate action still all that important?
Yeah, look, it's absolutely essential. There are no silver bullets. No one actor can solve the problem. No one technology can solve the problem. We need all hands on deck. So governments have a very important role to play. Businesses have a vital role to play. And One of the most exciting things that's happened in the last 5 years, literally, is that the business community has, in many countries, got ahead of their governments in understanding that smart climate action will be better for their long-term and even their medium-term bottom line, for two reasons. One, if you don't focus on issues of climate change, you can get into trouble very quickly. So there's the risk side. Two, there's the return side, that actually there are some real exciting opportunities to be made. And one of the things that we need to look for is really to understand the way that the dynamics of how governments respond to corporates and corporates respond to governments, both respond to citizens, and getting, if you like, an upward spiral of encouragement whereby a government will say, well, actually, maybe you're right. We should put the following regulations on. We should put a carbon price on. Why? Because actually our leading corporations are telling us that would actually help them to do it, and vice versa. So you get what we like to call an ambition loop, whereby you essentially get a sort of upward spiral of ambition. And I mean, we're hoping and praying that that is happening in the lead up to the big climate conference later on this year in Glasgow.
Well, that upward spiral bumps up against the wall of impenetrable wall of resistance from the status quo and the incumbents. And I guess one of the challenges there is, how do we break through that? Is it regulation? Is it heavy-handed government coming in, or can the private sector do this on themselves? What's it going to take to get past the fossil fuel lobby, certainly here in the United States, but beyond the US and some of the other, I guess, obstructionist more sectors and companies that just like the way things are now from a pure standpoint of their profits and shareholder engagement?
Well, look, you're absolutely right. I mean, just because we see great examples of corporate and government leadership, we should not assume that the battle is won. There are massive vested interests and locked-in capital. Sometimes management gurus like to talk about the need for disruptive change. I always used to think, well, why does change have to be disruptive? I mean, why can't we just have change? Isn't that easier? And the reason we need disruptive change is because of something called path dependency. And path dependency is we're on a path. We actually know it's not the best path, but we can't get to the better path because there's locked-in capital and there's vested interests that have been built up, quite frankly, over the last century or even more. So, for example, we know, I mean, if you're a citizen of Mexico City, you know that it's not the optimal to spend 2 hours in traffic, or if you're a poor person, have to change buses 4 times in order to get to work. You get home from work, after your children have gone to bed. We actually now have huge amounts of data that show that actually a modern public transport system is cheaper than investing in more roads and bridges and so on. But we now have locked-in capital, and we have vested interests who will fight it. And that's why, and by the way, that's just one example. One could give many, many examples of vested interest and locked-in capital. And that's why we need disruptive change. Disruptive change is the only way you can get from one path-dependent trajectory onto a much better one. And so, as you say, we've got to find ways of breaking those vested interests. What we're now seeing, of course, is for more generally fossil fuels. We're seeing activism in shareholder meetings, for example. So we need all the tools at our disposal. And if you're a philanthropy like the Bezos Earth Fund, you have to think about, okay, what is needed in order to get to a tipping point so that change becomes irreversible and irresistible.
Well, I want to get into the Bezos Fund a little bit in a few minutes, but you brought up Mexico City and things like that. And that brings up a topic that's also related here, that one of the places where people, planet, and profit come together is in the world of environmental justice. And given the awakening that we seem to have had around social equity and social justice and financial inequality. And as that starts to align with the climate crisis and starting to see that the most vulnerable people are the ones who are, well, the poorest people are the ones who are most vulnerable to the ravages of climate change. How should the issue of environmental justice shape climate policy and climate action?
Well, and climate change, as you imply, is fundamentally a moral issue, as well as being an environmental issue and an economic issue, a financial issue. It is a moral issue. Not only climate change, but basically all forms of environmental damage have been proven time and time again to hurt poor people, minorities, people of color, worse than better off people. Poor people breathe more polluted air. The quality of their water is worse. If they live in cities, the summer temperatures are much higher. Why? Because they don't have green spaces to absorb the heat. You have heat islands, so to speak, and time and also, by the way, they pay more for their electricity, for air conditioning, because often they can't afford the same kind of high energy efficient homes and so on. So there's a great unfairness here, and that needs to be looked at frontally. And to be absolutely honest, the environmental movements in most countries have not been leaders in this. That is now changing. And we now recognize that we need to address issues of climate justice. One, because it is morally right to do it, because these are people who suffer more. Two, because actually these frontline people are the ones that are most likely to come up with the right solutions to address the problem. And as we think about the kind of radical changes we need in policies and investment, we have to make sure that that transition is just, because there are ways of addressing climate change that would hurt the poor even more. And so we need to address that. And one of the really encouraging things in this country right now, I'm speaking from Washington, D.C., is the new administration has adopted a policy called Justice 40. And what Justice 40 says is that of the large investment that the Biden administration is going to make in greener technologies, perhaps up to $1 trillion, 40% of that is going to be directed to benefit areas of disadvantage and areas of color and indigenous people. And that's very difficult to do, but it's a pretty revolutionary policy. And we're certainly hoping to be helpful in that regard as well.
So talk a little bit about what that looks like on the ground in terms of how these policies manifest into actual practices that align the needs of the most vulnerable citizens with the needs of a changing climate.
Well, what's happened so far is that partly because wealthier people have the ability to hire lawyers, and the so-called NIMBY, not in my backyard, is just much more prevalent in nice suburban areas. What we've seen is that polluting industries are more prevalent in low-income areas. And as I said before, we have paid almost no attention to the differential effect of climate change and environmental damage on others. Indeed, if one looks at the way that data systems have been created, it's true to say that those who design the data systems, a bit analogous to those who write the history books, will influence what the data looks at and the implications thereof. And we need to really rethink the way we do that. And so the idea is to make sure that, unlike in previous eras, when we spend public money, that public money is actively monitored geographically and socioeconomically so that poor areas benefit more. And by the way, I mean, I'm talking about the United States, how much more important it is globally to think about these issues. Think about the impacts at the moment on poor farmers in the Sahel in Africa. I mean, even before climate change, it was hard to eke out a living. You now imagine with temperatures over 1 degree Celsius higher and water being much less reliable, what life is like. And we need to address this with great urgency.
Who needs to address that? Is that the private sector, the public sector? What's it going to take, whether it's farmers in Africa or people living in Bangladesh or other places that are just, I mean, everybody knows what's coming for them. We all can see it, just as we've been seeing for 30 years now, this pattern of temperature change and so many other indicators on the natural systems. We knew that was coming. It's happening a little bit faster than the scientists thought, but it's happening pretty much as planned. So we know this is coming for the flooding and drought and all these things that is going to disrupt, if not end, people's lives. What should we be doing now to address that?
Well, look, I mean, obviously, governments have a primary responsibility for making sure that their citizens have the access to a resilient future. So when it comes to adaptation, especially as it affects poor people, governments need to step up, and international agencies, whether it's the United Nations or whether it's the multilateral development banks, they need to show a much greater attention to these issues. I mean, traditionally, we've paid a lot more attention, as you know, and you've written about, Joel, to the so-called mitigation, that's stopping climate change, than we have to the so-called adaptation and resilience agenda, which is how do we adapt and become resilient to climate change. That needs to change. And a couple of years ago, the Dutch government, some other governments, and the World Resources Institute set up something called the Global Adaptation Commission. And we had Ban Ki-moon, Bill Gates, and Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, were the co-chairs of that. And they took this job because they felt very strongly that that we needed to change the calculus. And it turns out that just in the case of mitigation, where if you take smart action against climate change, you don't only stop bad things happening, you actually open up the door to all kinds of good things happening, new technologies, a better future, a different future. So too, when it comes to adaptation, actually smart action opens up new opportunities. And indeed, I mean, most of us in our history could identify some action maybe 50 years ago, 100 years ago, where our family had to adapt. And as a result of that, things either got a lot worse or they got a lot better. And we need to be really smart about understanding adaptation better.
And of course, we don't have to, you're not saying that we need to stop the mitigation piece. That still is critical, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, that has to be the starting point. And my goodness me, as you've written about many times, I mean, yeah, we are about to go into the biggest, economic shift that we've perhaps ever had, and it's a very exciting one. This is the decisive decade. We often like to say that this decade we have to halve carbon emissions, and the next decade we have to halve them again, and then in the 2040s we have to halve them again. We've never done anything like that in history, and it opens up incredibly exciting economic and social opportunities, but it also requires a level of leadership that so far we haven't managed to muster.
Yeah. Where do you think that leadership needs to come from? I mean, obviously, the answer would be CEOs and heads of state, but I think there's a case to be made that leadership can also be from the bottom up. What are you seeing?
Well, absolutely. I think one of the reasons we've seen an impressive rise in leadership in the corporate and even the government sector is because citizens have demanded it. And actually, those of us, and I'm sure that included you, Joel, who were in Paris in 2015 and saw the Paris deal being hammered together, we were worried that it wouldn't work. Why? Because it was predicated on a sort of voluntary approach. Okay, so the 193 odd countries, they have to put voluntary offers to improve the way they manage their economies so as to lower carbon emissions. But obviously, the first round of such offers were pitifully inadequate. And the whole Paris agenda was predicated on the assumption that actually, as years went by, costs would fall of new technologies, citizens would demand more, politics would change, and the climate, by the way, would get worse. So those things would all put pressure so that you would ramp up the level of ambition. But a lot of people were very critical of the Paris deal because it was voluntary. And yet, I mean, quite honestly, and I include myself in this, I would not have imagined that by 2021, 100 countries, governments would be committed to net zero by the middle of the century. Nor that 2,000 major corporations would be committed by the middle of the century, and an entirely impressive group of over 100 major companies, including companies like Amazon, by the way, are saying actually 2050 is too late. We're going to do it by 2040. Now, why are they doing that? It's because they now understand the new climate economics, that actually acting sooner rather than later for them will position them well, because their workers are wanting them to do it, their bondholders are wanting them to do it, their shareholders wanting them to do it, and citizens more generally are wanting them to do it. So it's a pretty exciting time. The issue is not whether we're improving rapidly. We are. It's whether they're improving rapidly enough, and they are not.
Yeah, I think that's one of the criticisms that the whole net zero movement has come under, or for that matter, the Science-Based Target Initiative. There's hundreds and hundreds of companies that have signed on to that. But from what I understand, none of them is on a path to actually achieve the goals of setting science-based targets and achieving them by 2050, 2040, whenever that is. And I guess that breeds sort of the natural cynicism that people have about a lot of these commitments, and they think that it's kind of a lot of window dressing and vague commitments that will be, no one will be accountable until the people who are making them now are no longer around or even alive. So is this window dressing, or do you actually think that we're on a different trajectory than we've been?
Oh, yeah, I'm more positive than your question would imply, Joel. Yeah, I think there are now several hundred companies that not only have set zero carbon targets by the middle of the century, which, fair enough, as you say, the CEOs will all have retired or have left this earth by then. But they've translated those into science-based targets. And the Science-Based Targets Initiative basically says, okay, you've got to have your long-term goal, but you have to be transparent about what you're doing in the next 5 years and 10 years. And you have to report each year. Now, it's not easy because, as you know, there's scope 1, which is emissions from your own factories, scope 2, which is the energy you use, and scope 3 is the difficult one, which is everything, all your suppliers, and then all your buyers. So that's scope 3. It's the entire, if you like, value chain. That's hard to drive that. I mean, if you're Walmart and you have 100,000 suppliers, to persuade them all to get onto the science-based targets is hard work, but they are trying, and these are early days. And certainly scope 1 and 2, we're seeing some very remarkable commitments to fully net zero energy, for example, and that's quite encouraging. And a company like Amazon, for example, has said, look, we obviously emit a lot of carbon in our delivery vans, and so we're going to purchase 100,000 electric vans, which is hard to do in this country. How do you get the supply? So then they go and buy a vehicle company, Rivian, in order to enable them to do it. That's one example of many that companies are having to take action. So the issue, to my mind, is not whether some of them are doing it. Some of them definitely are. The issue is whether enough of them are doing it that we will actually get to where we need to get to. And the answer to that is not yet.
Yeah. I don't think too many companies have the wherewithal to buy a electric vehicle company in order to create its own supply chain. But it is definitely a leadership initiative. So, of course, all this is colored by this moment, coming out of a pandemic, or at least trying to. Do you think the pandemic has taken us off course, or has it somehow contributed to realizing that we need to address the climate crisis at a deeper level? What have we learned here?
Well, I think we thought when it started, it would take us a long way off track. And I think we now realize that actually it created an environment in which there is much greater willingness to act. And I think you've written about this yourself, Joel. I think it's actually quite remarkable how the psychology of citizens has shifted. And we've also seen, so one, it's a risky world. We now know that we have to think about risks and be bold about how we address them. But a second thing we've learned is that things can happen much more quickly than we thought, and that science is a great gift from God. And my goodness me, I think even the arrival of the vaccine so quickly has reminded people that, my word, we can do things. And so too, we can adjust the way we live. I mean, I haven't been to the office for the last year and 4 months. And my work has been highly productive, I think, and so is yours, for example. That's an amazing change. We never would have predicted that. So I think the whole idea of risk and the willingness to act has been important. And then finally, I think it's important, as you know, the world's governments are currently spending more money than ever before in the history of the world. I mean, $14 trillion so far has been earmarked to reboot the world economy. And of course, you can invest in yesterday's economy, or you can invest in tomorrow's economy. And so, so far, the picture is mixed. Too many governments are still investing backwards in yesterday's economy, but a growing number are actually saying, why don't we use this boost to invest in tomorrow's economy? And there's now overwhelming evidence from international organizations like OECD and the World Bank, and lots of leading think tanks like the World Resources Institute, that basically are showing that we get more jobs and we get better jobs if we invest in tomorrow's economy. That doesn't mean that everybody is a winner, and we need to do a much better job of thinking about those who lose jobs. So it's tempting to say, well, here in the United States, there are only 60,000 coal miners, whilst there are 2 million jobs already in renewable energy. So problem solved. Well, no, there's still 60,000 families that need to think about their future, and we haven't thought enough about it.
Yeah. One of the things we're seeing with the vaccine right now is that the rich countries are getting it and the poor countries aren't. And in fact, some of the least well-off countries may not be seeing enough vaccine into 2022 or maybe even 2023. Do you think we've learned anything from the pandemic about creating equitable development for the world's vulnerable? I'm not sure we have yet, but I'm curious, what are the lessons here, and what can we do? What can we pull from the pandemic around this?
Well, we've certainly learned, as if we needed to learn it, about human nature. I mean, it really is embarrassing, isn't it, that whilst we all have, certainly here in the United States, we have unlimited amounts of vaccines, and it's a wonderful gift, and take my hat off to the government for doing it. And what have we been doing to help the rest of the world? Yes, there are some COVAX type programs, but many parts of the world will not receive a vaccine until the end of 2022 or 2023. So, shame on us in that regard. Is there something to learn? Yes, I do believe that there's now some pretty good momentum. I do think the G20 and G7, of this year are really doing their best. But at a time when we've spent, $14 trillion on reboosting our own economies, it's a shame that international development spending seems to be flatlining, or even in some countries declining. and that's very unfortunate. And an unfortunate side element of that is that in the lead up to the climate summit in Glasgow in November, the degree of trust on the part of low-income countries is not what it needs to be. The reason that Paris succeeded is that there was a huge amount of work to really persuade each other that we're all in this together and we're all going to help each other out. And there's a feeling in parts of the developing world, and indeed in the small island developing states, that actually that's not happening enough. So it's not too late, but we do need to act on that.
Yeah, I think it was Stephen Covey who said that change happens at the speed of trust, and that certainly is the case when it comes to things like COP. So Andrew, where does the Bezos Earth Fund fit into all this? How is it aiming to address so many of these issues that we're talking about?
Well, I think the fact that Jeff Bezos, committed $10 billion, not to create some eternal foundation that's going to last forever, but to be spent down in this decade. I think it says several things. It says, my goodness me, people that really understand business also understand how important it is. It also says that, people like Jeff Bezos and other leaders understand this is a pretty pivotal decade. And so the question for us is how do we use that in the most effective way? I mean, it sounds like a lot of money, which it is. But on the other hand, compared to the needs, it's small. And so the way we think about things is probably the same way you do, which is this decade, there needs to be a whole set of transitions. There are big transitions: energy and transport, the built environment, agriculture and food, manufacturing, consumption. Those are sort of big. Within each of those, there are mini or maxi sub-revolutions. So in transport, we've got to get rid of the internal combustion engine. We've also got to invest in the hydrogen economy. In food, we've got to not only create much higher yields, so we take pressure off the forests, but we also need to halve food loss and waste, and we need to start shifting diets towards more plant-based. So if you look at all these sort of mini revolutions, there are about 40 or 50 of them. And about half of them have coalitions working on them, public, private, NGO. Some are going very well, don't need any help from us. Wind energy in Texas certainly doesn't need any help from us. Others are sort of stuck in the mud, not really going anywhere. Some will need basic research, in which case we will invest in basic research. Others at the other extreme might need citizen action, political advocacy, policy change. Some will need markets to be made. They'll have a technology, but there's no market yet. Some will need monitoring and accountability. And so if you look at the grants we're making, they cover these different elements, but carefully chosen. Why? Because in order to get across those tipping points, to make things irresistible and unstoppable, you will need different things in the different revolutions, if you like. And we're helping to run something called the System Change Lab, which monitors these revolutions and identifies what are the lessons for them. Why do some topics suddenly rise on the agenda? Why did plastics in the ocean suddenly rise on the agenda? Whilst other topics that should be obvious, like energy efficiency in buildings, actually is sort of not really progressing anywhere near where it ought to be, even although it pays for itself within 3 years. So there's some pretty interesting questions. And so what we're trying to do is be fairly forensic, but then act quickly and boldly, injecting resources and convening and supporting coalitions.
Yeah, you mentioned system change, and that's a topic been thinking about a lot lately, and starting to write a little bit about. People say we need to change the system. The system needs to change. I don't think many people understand what system change actually means. I'm wondering, what does it mean for you and the Bezos Earth Fund?
Well, what it means is that, in its simplest forms, is that the notion that one actor doing one set of things can solve these problems is actually not very accurate. So why are we losing forests in Southeast Asia? Two words: palm oil. Now, in the old days, a non-system change approach would be to say, well, obviously, palm oil shouldn't cut down forests, so the government should have a policy that says no cutting down the forests for palm oil. Well, the system change would say, well, that's all very well, but what do they do with the revenue they've lost? And when you and I buy palm oil every single day in the supermarket, half of all of the items in supermarkets contain palm oil, where does it come from then? And so a system change approach would say, actually, what we need are different players to shift the entire way of doing business. So not only do you need governments to commit to that, you need the smallholder associations who actually need to increase yields of smallholders because they're causing lots of problems. You need the traders in Singapore to be driven by the Unilevers and the Chinese buyers to say, actually, we need proof that the palm oil we're buying actually is honorable. And then you'd say, well, how on earth are we going to get the proof? Well, then you need the scientists and the satellite operators. In the case of this, Global Forest Watch, which is run by the World Resources Institute and 50 other institutions, it can monitor week by week where trees are falling down to 1/10 of a hectare everywhere on the Earth's surface. So it can now say there are 1,000 palm oil mills in Southeast Asia, and we know where they get their palm oil from. We are able to tell you with significant probability which of those are honorable and which of those are dishonorable in terms of cutting down the forests. And so then, if you're head of Unilever, you could say, okay, of the 1,000, we're buying from 800 of them. We're going to drop the 200 that are worst, and we'll be down to 600. You gradually change. So system change is thinking through soup to nuts from all the way from the farm through to you and I, who will consume palm oil 4 times today.
So that also speaks to who else needs to be at the table. In one of the more recent episodes of the Voices of Sustainability, this chat series, talked about the impact of climate change on Indigenous communities, including the critical issue of having Indigenous peoples and their knowledge in climate adaptation efforts. Are you seeing good examples of that? Or are we actually tapping into that knowledge and wisdom?
Well, we're not seeing enough of it. We're seeing some, and it really does work. We've done a lot of work that shows that if you not only give Indigenous people legal right to the land that they have customarily managed, but you also give them the right to actually exercise that legal right in the courts, you will find that deforestation will be 90% less than it would in surrounding areas that are owned by regular private property rights or by open access. And so it's not easy always to make this work, but there are some wonderful examples right now. And certainly for the Bezos Earth Fund, we hope to really support the protection of nature in quite a big way. We don't just do climate, we also do nature. And we would certainly be hoping to be as helpful as we can to key Indigenous groups.
Yeah, we're almost out of time, but I want to get in 2 quick questions. First of all, a question from the audience. What do you expect to see coming out of COP26 in November?
Well, what we expect or what we hope, and the coming few months, hopes and expectations need to merge. We need to see more ambition. As you know, under the Paris rules, after 5 years, each country is supposed to come back with an enhanced so-called NDC. That's their climate goal to 2030 now. So far, about 100 have come back, and about half of those are considerably better than previous ones. Some are not any better, and some of those countries have admitted they're not any better, and they're going to come back again. We now need the others to come forward. You got some very good, I mean, and quite frankly, what Europe's doing at the moment is deeply impressive. Not easy to get 27 countries to agree to lower emissions by 55%. And that's impressive. The UK is also 65%. The United States, I mean, amazing progress, commitment to 50 to 52%. Now, those are commitments, and we now need, obviously, to see some reaction. So the most important thing is that we reach Glasgow seeing a critical mass that actually gets the message of the IPCC report that just came out. And I think that report will actually be a real kick in the pants to everybody, all decision makers everywhere. If it's not, then they should not be leaders. I mean, it is astonishing what that report says, and I would urge everybody to read it. So that's the first thing. But then there are several secondary or not secondary things. They have this wonderful process called the race to zero, where the private sector and governments are sort of at the sectoral level making commitments, and nature-based solutions are going to be pretty important. So that's a second issue. A third one is adaptation, which we mentioned before. It needs to show, I mean, there really does need to be a sort of a justice, a climate justice component. And a fourth is money. Everyone's heard of the $100 billion that was originally pledged in Copenhagen in 2009, that by 2020, there would be $100 billion per year of support. And that means support provided by official and philanthropy together. So far, we haven't reached 100 billion a year. We're running at about 85 to 90 billion. That politically, that's very important. I mean, another 10 billion at one level doesn't matter that much. I mean, there's much bigger sums of money being invested in the private sector and so on, but it matters a lot politically to build trust. So we absolutely need to see, as the G20 forms its policies, we need to see you're going the extra mile, getting out of comfort zones, and making more generous offers.
Well, Andrew, we're not out of topics, but we are out of time. But before I let you go, one last question, really briefly. How do you stay hopeful?
Well, the same way you do, Joel, which is you look out there and you look at those that are fighting day in, day out. They're my kids and yours probably. They are citizens in Africa. They are CEOs in boardrooms. They are activists all over. There are some good governments. So look, we have to focus on the positive, whilst not being naive about it. One of the sort of interesting questions I was asked recently was, so two experts on climate change who've spent their entire life on climate change, and you ask one of them, how's it going? And they say, it's amazing. I mean, it's so fantastic. Solar prices have fallen by 99%, and we're doing this and that. Great. You ask the other guy, so how's it going? He said, we're falling off a cliff. It's Armageddon. It's a disaster. And the question is, which is right? And of course, the answer is they both are. They both are right. We're doing a lot better. But the problem is that the problem is getting bigger and bigger as well. And so we've got to think of something transformative that we can do in order to catch up with that problem. And I am hopeful, and that's why I'm in this job and you're in that job, and why the Zayed Sustainability Prize is inspiring people year after year.
Yeah, it's not a question of whether the glass is half empty or half full. It's whether the glass is big enough. And I think that's what we're up against here. Andrew, thank you so much for your time. I know we're all looking forward to seeing the continued initiatives and progress out of the Bezos Earth Fund, and how you're deploying that considerable, but insufficient for the world, but considerable amount of money that Jeff Bezos has put in to address climate crisis. Thank you again for your time today, Andrew.
Great. Thank you, Joel. A real pleasure.
And thank you all for tuning in. If you want to watch, rewatch, or share this episode, it will be posted on the Zayed Prize's YouTube channel. For now, on behalf of the Zayed Sustainability Prize, I'm Joel Makower. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great day.